a best before date. No term limits for our politics panelists, though. We're joined this evening by Graham Thomson, columnist with the Edmonton Journal, and a Mount Royal University tandem tonight. Dwayne Bratt, chair and professor in the Department of Policy Studies, and political scientist Laurie Williams. Good evening, folks.
Good evening.
Welcome back.
Good evening, Michael.
Some of you from holidays. Very nice to see you. Okay, last week, PC leadership candidate and frontrunner Jim Prentice made a political splash saying he would institute term limits for provincial politicians, 3 terms for an MLA, 2 for a premier. Prentice has since had something of a change of heart, and there has now been reference to implementing an internal PC party policy. Graham, this initial suggestion generated a lot of negative reaction. Questions of constitutionality. Your paper today, posting an editorial, calling this a non-starter, purely pie in the sky on the part of the Prentice campaign?
You know, it sounds like desperation. This is playing into the cynical view of politicians that, you know, they don't deserve a good pay, they don't deserve a pension plan, that they're in it just for themselves, and that you shouldn't trust politicians. It's playing into the cynical view of politics. It's unfortunate. To me, this is also not really well thought out. And it sounds like...
Prentice is a lawyer, though.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing about it. It sounds like he's pandering to people who have got tired of his own government. He's pandering to people he's trying to distance himself from his own government, from people in his government. People think this government's been around for too long. It's been around for 40 years. So maybe there should be a term limit on governments as opposed to just politicians. I think it was ill-conceived. He's trying to back away from it now. But this shows to me that he is trying to distance himself from a very unpopular government and people in his own government. And he's more or less saying that the premier shouldn't be the premier, that Dave Hancock should have retired years ago.
Been gone a long time.
And Doug Horner. So I think that this is not, to me, a well thought out strategy.
Dwayne, what do you think's driving this suggestion in the first place? Is Prentice positioning himself for a house cleaning, a preemptive strike, the opposition? What do you think?
I think it's the appeal to populism, this idea that we can't trust politicians, therefore we have to put limits on them. The problem, this was not well thought out. There's a reason that we don't have term limits in any parliamentary system. It's designed for an American system where there's a clear separation between the executive branch of government and the legislative branch of government. And you only have term limits at the executive branch. So because the premier is also an MLA, it makes it really complicated. So it's one of those things that sounds really good in the first 30 seconds of what you say, you know, at a speech, but the more you start to think about it, the worse it gets. And what surprised me was the timing. I mean, he made this the focal point of his policy accountability speech. So I was wondering, was this the plan all along, that he was going to discuss term limits as the solution to everything that ails Alberta politics? Or was this a sign of desperation that the campaign is not going as well as he thought? Or was it a sign that, well, maybe the campaign's going okay, but I'm really worried about the Wild Rose, and if I can pull a plank out of their old playbook, maybe I can do something?
Well, and Laurie, did the Wild Rose not wade into this one as well and then eventually back off?
Well, I think the problem is that it's just not going to be effective. You really can't legislate virtue. I mean, it's one of the few times I have the opportunity to quote Plato on this program. But I mean, it's like cutting off the Hydra's head. You can't actually solve this problem through institutional mechanisms. We're looking for people that are good stateswomen and statesmen, and that's the real solution. But more than anything else to me is that this is going to be, it won't be effective. It won't deal with any of the problems that we're looking at. Alison Redford would not have been caught by this. Very unpopular former premier. The most popular Albertans and former premiers, Klein and Lougheed, would have been prevented from doing much of what was very popular about their mandates by this policy. And I think there's another question here. It's not just that it's ineffective, undemocratic, unconstitutional, but it's the whole question of are you going to be able to actually solve the problems that are in question here? Are you going to be able to address what's really going on without tarring those who are engaged in genuine public service?
Graham, in your first response, you used the term desperation. I've read it in your column as well in reference to the Prentice campaign. Why in this late stage of the race would that campaign be desperate?
This is a really good question. We're getting the sense that the race isn't going as well for Jim Prentice than we thought it was. You know, we thought he'd be the front runner for the whole thing and he'd just sail into a first ballot victory. He may still win on the first ballot, but it seems he's having more trouble than we thought. He is, for example, giving away the memberships. He's not just selling them, he's giving them away, which is an indication that he's having a hard time selling memberships. We've heard that overall the sales are not going well for the memberships for any of the party, the candidates. Last time around, I think we had like 60,000 people voted in the first ballot in 2011. We're thinking maybe 30 or 40,000 might maybe tops be voting this time around. McIver, Lukaszuk, and Prentice are all having problems selling memberships, engaging people. And this race is all about selling memberships and getting those people out to vote. It's not about a general public opinion poll. It's about, can you sell memberships? And it seems that Prentice is having a harder time. And I think that he's having a harder time overall selling himself. And also there's that blowback against the party and just how unpopular Redford has proven to be. That's been a problem. So he's trying to get people to come out and vote for him, and he's trying to find a reason to give them to come out and elect him. And this, to me, is this desperation move about this term limits plays into that.
Another of our regular panelists, Dave Cornway, has been blogging of late. The Prentice campaign is less dynamic and more vulnerable every day. Dwayne, could there be a sudden race here?
I'm not sure it's a race. I think there's a difference between winning and really winning. You know, if Jim Prentice pulls this off on the first ballot and less than 20,000 people vote, I'm not sure that's a real victory. If he wins this without saying anything throughout the entire campaign, and whether you like the term limits or you don't, at least it was a new idea that he did. But if you win without saying anything, have you really won? So I think those are the challenges. The bar for Jim Prentice is much higher than in a normal leadership race, because it's not about becoming premier anymore. It's about positioning the party for the next general election. And I'm not sure this leadership campaign has done that very much for the party.
And Laurie, Graham brings up the issue of how many memberships have maybe been sold, considerably fewer than what were sold back in 2011. How much hinders or how much hangs on that, do you feel?
Well, part of the reason I think there were more memberships sold in the last two leadership races is because people were really worried about what the outcome was going to be. When people kind of think it's a foregone conclusion, you're not going to get the same kind of energy and investment. But it does really raise questions about the legitimacy of the winner. Do they really represent a broad swath of Albertans? Are they the kind of leaders that can really connect with Albertans or even members of their own party? And those are real issues. And I think there are other questions here about Jim Prentice's leadership. He looks very indecisive in some cases. You know, even questions raised about initially saying, well, he didn't want free memberships or wasn't associated with that, and then said it was okay. This sort of Mr. Dithers label, I think, is one that he risks bringing upon himself, and just the lack of vision and seeing what with this idea that he thought, I suppose, in a moment of inspiration, thought it might be a good idea, but he didn't follow it through, didn't think it through, and that raises real questions about his capacity as a leader.
Real quick last thought.
I was going to say, even Dwayne's right, he did bring forward an idea, Prentice brought forward an idea. The problem is he didn't stick with it. His idea of term limits, he had to backtrack from that. So he brings up an idea and he's shot down and he has to backtrack. So even his one idea he brought forward to be unique is actually proven to, I think, undermine his position.
All right, time for a break. Up next, the cost of roaming for one Alberta politician, it might prove steep.